Welcome back to JMC 6000 in the JMC Garage for this week's JMC Garage Talk. And this week we're talking about fuel injection. Now this kind of be building off of the video that the Car Care Nut channel provided. He talked about fuel injection in a two-part series. What I want to do is kind of go in depth more with fuel injection, kind of go through the highlights, some of the latest fuel injection systems, and kind of explain exactly what they do and what they mean. I believe the Car Care Nut channel kind of did a basic and a general overview of fuel injection, and it was very good. I watched both videos, but what I wanted to do in this video is kind of go a little bit more in depth to some of the things that weren't talked about, but that's okay. We're going to go in depth into this video, and I'm going to have two different vehicles for an example. The first one we're going to go over is what this Buick is representing, and that is early 80s through the 90s GM technology, because GM at one time had 3 different fuel injection systems. Yes, 3 different ones that they utilized in their vehicles. In fact, at that time, they actually had 4 different ones, 3 different fuel injection systems, and one of them was a carburetor. All in the 80s, absolutely crazy, but we're going to go through that. So, from the very beginning, people were looking at fuel injection as a great way to introduce fuel into the engine via the carbureted system, or via outside of the carbureted system. So GM was one of the first to pioneer this back in the 50s with their mechanical fuel injection. You can actually get a 57 Corvette, some of the early 60s cars, some Bel Airs, all with this early mechanical fuel injection system. I'm not going to really dive into that because that fuel injection system was totally mechanical. Pretty cool system. It had a lot of intricacies and working parts to it, but I believe GM did a good job. It didn't really take off though, and I think because it was cost-wise, it wasn't very feasible for GM to continue making that or continue to develop that, so they kind of abandoned it by the mid to late 60s. GM kind of was doing away with that mechanical fuel injection system. But again, GM was probably one of the first to introduce any kind of fuel injection. Now, fuel injection was kind of reintroduced back into the mid to late 70s, especially with emissions regulations coming down the pike, gas prices that were just going through the roof. There was a gas shortage. People were looking for ways to get better economy out of the engines that they were producing. And the best way to do that was change its fuel delivery system. Hence the reason why fuel injection started coming back onto the scene in the mid to late 70s. And with the invention of the computer, now computers are starting to be a little bit smaller. Now we can introduce something called electronic fuel injection, or fuel injection that's controlled by computers, at least with some simple and variable steps. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to grab my computer. I'm going to show you some different fuel injection systems, talk about them before we dive into what's in front of us with the Buick, and then we're going to conclude the video describing some of the latest and greatest fuel injection that is found in vehicles today. So bear with me. All right, now that I have my computer, I wanted to go through the different systems, especially how GM kind of pioneered that in the 80s. Let me make a correction. GM didn't really pioneer it, but they really made it popular. For example, Henry Ford, back in the early 20s, even before that, didn't really pioneer the assembly line, but he made it popular and made it acceptable to really push out the Model T. Again, GM really made fuel injection possible throughout the 80s, so I wanted to kind of go through that with the different, again, 3 different systems that they had in the 80s. 3 different ones, and one of them was even used all the way up until about the mid-90s, and that's how popular it was. But let's kind of go through that. Number 1, before we jump into this, Bosch came out with fuel injection, electronic fuel injection, even before that, and was using that in early 80s vehicles. GM kind of took that and kind of mass marketed it into a lot of their vehicles in the 80s. And then back then, GM was known as a brand under many brands. They had Chevy, Buick, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, even different other brands and other things. It was crazy, all the brands they had back then. But one of the early versions of GM's fuel injection has to be the throttle body fuel injection. Basically, as many would call it, as Car Care Nut called it, a glorified carburetor. Now, as you can see with throttle body, you have 2 injectors. Some on the smaller engines, like the 2.5 Iron Duke, utilize just a single injector on top of a throttle plate. Now, the dual injection system was used on the 4.3 V6, was used on the 305 V8, was used on the 350. In fact, GM had a version of this called the crossfire injection, where they used a single injector on top of the throttle plate, where they had on one side of the intake manifold, and then they had the exact same injection system on the other side, staggered on the intake manifold, and that was their, what they called their crossfire injection. I'm not going to go into that. Let's kind of go over the basics. Two injectors on top of the throttle plate. Basically, they alternated on when they sprayed and fired. And of course, the more you open a throttle plate, it would tell the throttle position sensor, which would relate to the computer, to spray more fuel into the intake manifold. And then one of the things that GM really pioneered was what this thing is right here. And that is called the idle air control valve. Now, on most GM systems of fuel injection, as of until later when we add the introduction of a electronic throttle body, GM, what they called, use a idle air control valve, or IAC for short. And this system is actually meant to control the idle air going into the engine. This way you're not playing with the throttle, but the throttle can be at a set close position, and if you needed additional air, let's see, the air conditioning turned on, or you're turning the power steering or anything like that, the idle air control valve would open up a little valve that would actually let more idle air come into the system that would help it still continue to run. And what was neat about the idle air control valve is that the engine would still get fuel via the two injectors, because fuel would actually go past the throttle plates. Again, more air would be introduced via the idle air control valve. So one of the benefits about this is that even though engines that have throttle body fuel injection, even though GM's crossfire fuel injection, they didn't produce a lot of power. But I will say this, especially engines that just utilize throttle body, like in this fashion, or even the Iron Duke, they were dead reliable. I mean, every single time you go out there and turn the key, they would start, it would run, didn't matter what you did to it, didn't matter what, even if sensors were going out of whack, this didn't need a mass airflow sensor. They had very few sensors. You had a idle air control valve, you had a throttle position sensor, you had an oxygen sensor, and you also had an intake air temperature sensor, and also a water sensor as well, and that was it. This hardly needed any sensors for an engine to run, and it was reliable whether it was cold, reliable where it was hot. Any engine that had this system on it was super, super reliable, and that's what this was known for. But it wasn't known to be very efficient, and it wasn't known to produce a lot of power. Hence the reason why GM in the mid-80s, actually in the mid to early 80s, came up with what we call multi-port fuel injection. So multi-port fuel injection, which the early version of that was actually on the GM 3800, also known as the 3.8 liter V6. Multi-port now moves the injectors from on top of a throttle body behind the throttle plate to now the throttle plate is separate, and you have individual injectors for each and every port. Now, let me kind of go over basically what multi-port fuel injection is, or batch fire fuel injection. Now, you may be like, what's batch fire? I've heard of multi-port, and we see that here, but what's batch fire and what's bank fire? Well, I'm going to tell you, because GM utilized both types of fuel injection in the 80s and 90s with their multi-port system, and I'm going to go through a couple others on the computer. But to kind of reference that, let me turn this light on. Batch fire fuel injection in its simplest form is a technology that injects fuel directly into the intake runner, as we see here. It would have 8 or 6 individual injectors, whether it be V6 or V8, or if it's an inline 4 individual injectors, using 1 or 2 fuel rails. And basically how this injection would work in its simplest form, in the batch fire, it will use a crankshaft position sensor, not only tell the computer the engine revolutions per minute, or RPMs, but also tell the computer when top dead center is for cylinder number 1. Once it does that, it regulates how the rest of the computer will run the fuel injection. Now, on the batch fire, as soon as it got that signal, all 6, for a V6, all 6 injectors would fire at once. Bam. Fire at once. Doesn't matter if it's ready for it or not. Doesn't matter if it's on the intake stroke. They would all fire at once. Now, that was batch fire. Now, bank fire, which GM used on the earlier versions of the 3800, would fire 1 bank, Then it would alternate and fire the second bank. One bank, other bank. One bank, other bank. All relation to the crankshaft position sensor and where top dead center was on number 1 cylinder. So that's what they use. Now, later, after the batch fire, after the bank fire, came what we call known as sequential port fuel injection. This particular 3800, one of the advancements of this particular engine was sequential port fuel injection, where now not only do we have a crankshaft position sensor, but we also have a cam position sensor. What the cam position sensor does, it tells the computer not only where the engine is, but which cylinder needs to fire next in relation to that. So it's absolutely amazing. Now we have injectors, not only in the same position, but now they fire exactly when the intake valve is open, exactly for each and every cylinder, whether it be a V6 or V8. And one of the neat things that GM did when they came out with the 3800 was they did away with the distributor. Now that you have a cam position sensor, we now can use a coil pack and a coil module or an ignition module underneath the coil pack. So what that does, it helps to tell not only the computer when to fire the injector, but also when to fire the spark. Now, on the coil packs, like what we have here, you have 3 individual coil packs. It's actually 1 unit, but 3 individual slots. It would fire 1 where it would do 2 and 4, but 1 was wasted. 1 and 5, 1 was wasted, and alternated that way. So as one would fire, the other one was wasted. As another one would fire, the other one was wasted. But still, it was better than doing a distributor. It was better than having that whole system. GM was actually able to do more controlled spark, more controlled ignition, and controlled fuel injection with sequential port fuel injection. Absolutely amazing technology. Now, let me show you some other things that GM did in the 80s and 90s, because not many people know this. And where are we at for time? We're good on time? Oh, we got about a minute or 2 left, and then we're going to move on to the next section. But one of the things that GM was known for back in the day was, especially in their Vortec engines, which would be the 4.3, the 5 liter, and the 5.7, 350, 305, 262, 4.3 V6, was known as spider injection. Now, you may have heard of this, and you kind of see a picture up here, but before I get to that, the first version of this came out in 1992 for the Vortec 4.3 liter V6. Before it got turbocharged, it actually utilized spider injection, a central port injection, CPI, where it utilized a single injector right here. And you can tell this is a single injector because the exact same injector used right here. Exact same injector, and that is it. So you had a single injector, built-in fuel pressure regulator. You had a fuel inlet and a fuel return. And then you have what they call the spider, or the 6 ports with poppet nozzles that would go into each port. Now, this was a early version of batch fire injection. And all this does is, again, because this engine still utilized a distributor, GM, what they did was they used a single injector, fired it, and it would distribute fuel through these 6 rails and 6 rubber nozzles and all that. The only problem with this injection, it was known to leak. It was known to have issues. It wasn't as reliable as the old throttle body, but by introducing the fuel through poppet nozzles into each and individual port, even if it was batch fire, it produced a lot of power. In fact, back in those days, the 4.8 produced upwards of 200 horsepower, which was phenomenal for an older V6. Anyway, so GM took this design and they later introduced this monkey, this guy right here. So this right here actually utilizes individual injectors. This is sequential spider injection. Individual injectors are located in this module right here, and then they would release fuel into the poppet nozzles. So this was a little bit more of a better design to where it actually distributed fuel at each and every time the intake valve was open. This was for a V8. The only problem with this design is, again, what we had problems and issues with the CPI injection was these rails and these lines and these nozzles would leak. They would leak fuel inside the intake manifold. It would be an absolute disaster. And check engine lights will come on. The thing's running rich. They don't know why they have no power. It's because it's getting too much fuel. That's what the issue was with these. So aftermarket companies and GM came up with a later on design, which was this right here. This is the latest and greatest of the spider injection of the sequential bore fuel injection. And what they did with this was they actually moved the injectors from out of the module and onto every single port. And they actually got rid of the poppet nozzles that were such an issue and actually made wires for every injector to every single port. Anyway, that was the kind of the theory and really what GM was doing for fuel injection. Again, how they utilize and during this time in the 80s to 90s, they had 3 different injection systems and quite a bit 4 different injection systems all throughout this time period. They had the central port injection. They had the sequential port injection. They had throttle body injection. They had all different kinds of injection systems. It was crazy. But now today we come across direct and port injection engines, which we want to talk about in the next segment. So stay tuned for that. All right, now that the Buick's pulled out, we have the Ford Explorer in here. And the reason why the Explorer's in here is I wanted to highlight one of the greatest and best technologies. Not that Ford pioneered it. In fact, Toyota is one that pioneered the technology. And that is the 4DS system, where they utilize not only direct injection, but port injection as well. Now, the reason why I have this Ford Explorer in here is Ford started utilizing this same technology. I don't know if they bought it from Toyota, they just kind of took the idea from Toyota, but it's a great idea, and it's not just Toyota and Ford now, and other companies are starting to use this technology where you combine direct and port injection in the same engine. Ford started doing this in 2017, and now it's moving on to most of their turbocharged EcoBoost engines, from that point forward, including this guy right here. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. So I have my trusty flashlight now. The engine in my 25 Explorer, again, is the 2.3 EcoBoost MPC, which stands for Modular Power Cylinder. This is Ford's modular inline family that not only covers the 2.3, but covers the 2-liter that's coming into the 25 Ford Maverick, that's debuting in the 25 Bronco Sport, that was previously in the 24 and maybe 23, but mostly 24 Ford Escape for the 2-liter and the 1.5. And one of the things and one of the highlights of this engine has to be the dual or direct and port injection that Ford utilizes. So if you see right here, you see the frame rail, or I'm sorry, not the frame rail, but you see the fuel rail for the port injection, which is right here. And underneath the intake manifold, which is this big plastic piece, you see the throttle body here, which is electronic. You see the big plastic piece here. Underneath that is where the direct injectors are. So you have the port injection, and then underneath of this plastic intake manifold, you have the direct injection. And the direct injection pump, you may not be able to see it, but it's right back right there. One of the things I noticed when this engine is running is on a cold start, Ford actually uses both direct and port injection on the cold start. And you can always tell when the direct injection is running, because even though there is a foam piece around the direct injection pump, you can still hear it clacking away. Almost like a diesel, you can hear that. And I would say after a cold start, after this engine is running for about, about 5 to maybe 7 minutes, all of a sudden, once the idle dies down, it's running right about 1,000, maybe 900 RPMs. All of a sudden, the engine pitch changes totally. And what it is the direct injector, there is a solenoid inside that pump to where when it's activated, the pump is actually being utilized and pumping the high pressure that direct injection needs via the cam lobe on the exhaust side of the cam. Now, when that solenoid deactivates, it's no longer pumping that high pressure, therefore it's not able to utilize the direct injection anymore, and you can tell the pitch of the engine actually changes when that solenoid deactivates and the direct injection is no longer being used. The engine still is running the same, but now it's strictly running off the port injection and not necessarily the direct injection. What's nice about the dual injection, and I'm going to finish up with this video, it's a great advancement in technology, and GM kind of pioneered direct injection. Maybe not pioneered it, but they started mass producing it and mass marketing it in around 2012, maybe a little bit before, in the 3.6 Lamborghini vehicles, where it's the GM Traverse, Chevy Traverse, GMC Acadia, Saturn Outlook, the Buick Enclave. Those 4 vehicles, starting in about 08, 07, and later with using the 3.6, they first started that engine out with port injection, then they later moved to direct injection. I remember, and this is one of the things about direct injection, I remember back a friend of mine in Colorado bought a brand new 2012 Chevy Traverse. And I remember when he brought it home, he traded in his, I think it was an 04 Ford Explorer for that Traverse, was very excited about it. He had a family of like 6 people, so he loved the size and everything about the Traverse. And I remember when this car was even brand new, whenever he would do a cold start, again, remember this engine in that Traverse in 2012 was direct injection only, 3.6. I remember on a cold start, he would remove started, and every single time there would be, at least for a minute, like black smoke coming out of the exhaust pipes. I'm challenging you right now. Go and find an older Traverse or Saturn Outlook or any of those vehicles, and you start them up on a cold start, there's actually black smoke literally coming out of the exhaust pipes. That's how rich that engine ran, and it was only direct injection. Now, those engines are known for carbon buildup, and even more so for direct injection engines that are turbocharged. Hence the reason why Ford in 2017 and moving forward with a lot of their EcoBoost engines have introduced a dual injection system. Because when you remove the port injection and it's not spraying on the backside of the valves, it's not able to clean that carbon off the backside of the valves. And if that carbon builds up over time, it can really cause drivability issues. It can cause misfires. Not all the fuel and air, or not all the air rather, is able to get into the cylinder that could be getting in there. So the dual injection is a great idea. And one of the nice things about, like I said, this engine, when it's doing a cold start, actually runs on both port and direct, and it's actually able to scale it back a little bit. And then once it's sufficient and it's done with its cold idle, reaches a certain temperature, then it's able to shut off direct injection, just run on port injection. When this thing is cruising, it's actually more efficient at times to just use port injection. When you want more power, it's able to fire up both port and direct injection, like when you get on it. So anyway, it's a great system. I love how Ford and Toyota and others are now utilizing not just direct, not just port, but the dual injection system. And I think it's great. Anyway, if you guys know any more, or if you want to comment, like, comment, subscribe. This has been JMC 6000 in the JMC Garage for this week's JMC's Garage Talk, talking about fuel injection. Stay tuned for more videos to come. I got a video dropping this Wednesday about a minivan that was a viewer request, one of my subscribers' requests. We're going to review that as a JMC family review, so make sure you tune into that. Again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. It doesn't cost nothing for you to do that. And also, like and comment on the video. I'll read all the comments. I love all the comments. And we got some more videos to come. We'll see you on the next one. Be blessed.